This must be one of the most legendary clips in esports history.
But it is too late. Gerite is going to be waiting. Hiko charges in, doesn't check.
Oh,
What? Oh my god! Inhuman reactions!
Inhuman reactions. It looks like it shouldn't be possible to react this fast, but that's what you get when you react based on sound instead of visuals. I don't want to downplay how insane Hiko's reaction and aim were in this clip, but it's a simple biological fact. Human beings react faster to sound than they do to a visual stimulus. And this can make clips like this look a bit uncanny, or inhuman even. Most of the studies conclude that humans react roughly 50 milliseconds faster to sound than they do to light. So you can literally react faster than your eyes can see. And that 50 millisecond advantage is a lot when you consider that the visual reaction time of most pro players is around the 150 millisecond mark. Being able to react about 30% faster is not a small feat. And players that have learned to use this to their advantage are responsible for some of the most legendary clips in esports history.
Last player standing. One enemy remaining. Bir düşman kaldı.
These insane flick shots weren't possible because these players saw their opponents. They obviously did not. They won these fights because they were able to react based on sound. So you would think, given how important reaction times and sound are in competitive first-person shooters, that high-end gaming PCs would also be pretty good at low latency audio. But actually, they're not. For the last decade, the entire industry has been in an arms race over a different sense entirely. We got monitors with higher and higher refresh rates, faster GPUs, and technologies like NVIDIA Reflex. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for it, but it feels like every new product is trying to shave off yet another fraction of a millisecond between your click and the pixels changing on screen, while audio latency has been mostly neglected. See, this is CS2 running uncapped on a 240Hz monitor. I have a pretty decent gaming PC, not the latest and greatest hardware anymore, but I'm getting pretty low lag. Roughly 9 milliseconds of end-to-end latency. Video latency, that is. See, this little LDAT device here that's attached to the monitor measures the time it takes from the mouse click up until something changes on screen. And typically that happens pretty fast. Today's hard-end software is well optimized for this kind of lag. We're talking single-digit latency numbers for modern gaming peripherals. Like a good 240Hz monitor has a latency in the range of 2 to 3 milliseconds. Good gaming mice typically only have 1 or 2 milliseconds of latency, and the nice Hall effect keyboard can detect your key press in just a millisecond or even faster. Not to mention the super fast render times you can get with high-end GPUs and CPUs in optimized games. But watch this. This is the audio latency I've measured. Why is nobody talking about this? Everyone's obsessed with upgrading their PCs, monitors and mice for tiny sub-millisecond latency improvements, and yet we're getting audio latency that's magnitudes higher. So how can we fix this? Is there even a fix? What about fancy gaming decks like this? And wireless headsets? These are even worse for latency, right? Okay, let's actually test a few devices, starting with what probably most people are using, the audio ports on the PC straight from the mainboard. We can measure the audio lag with the LDAT device as well, just needs to be connected to the audio output so that it can hear the gunshot sound. I've also added an amplifier for better signal quality, and of course I've already tested and confirmed that it doesn't add any additional lag. So in CS2, my mainboard audio comes in roughly 95 milliseconds too late. Not good. Let's see if an external sound card like this can help. After all, it's built with gaming in mind. But well, actually, it's ever so slightly slower than the mainboard audio. Differences this small don't really matter when we're talking about latencies in the 100 millisecond range, but it certainly doesn't bring down the latency. And yes, I've tested the optical input too. So what about wireless then? I happen to have this headset lying around, so we might as well test it and see how terrible wireless actually is. Or maybe isn't. That's pretty close to wired actually. And keep in mind that this is not some crazy $300-400 wireless headsets. It's one of the most affordable 2.4 GHz headsets on the market. So yeah, good to see that you don't need to go out and buy a fancy new gaming deck or ditch your 2.4 GHz headset. You're getting terrible latency either way. No matter what, we're talking about audio lag in the 100 millisecond range. But you know, it's no coincidence that the 3 devices we've tested so far all ended up around the 100 millisecond mark. To really get to the bottom of this, it's time to bring out the big gun, the RME 80i-2/4 Pro SE, a $2,000 professional audio interface. It'll help us understand what's going on here. See, low latency is extremely important for music production, so this thing is actually built with a low latency in mind. So watch this. In a music production program, the latency with this RME interface is absolutely tiny. The sound arrives not even 3 milliseconds after the mouse click. That's magnitudes lower than everything we've seen so far. However, watch what happens when we switch back to CS. As soon as we're testing in-game, we're getting more or less the same latency as we got with all the other devices. What's causing all this latency is not really the audio device itself or even the USB connection. It's the game, the Windows Audio Engine, and the Audio API. Every step of the audio chain claims itself a little safety margin, a little audio buffer that's a few milliseconds long. And these buffers do add up. See, when testing outside of CS2, directly through the LDAT application, we can get an idea of how much latency the game itself is adding. In the LDAT application, we're getting almost 60 milliseconds less latency than in-game. So a big chunk of the overall latency comes from the game alone. Of course, not every game is the same. Some have more and some have less audio lag than others. Here's the latency I've calculated for CS, Overwatch and Valorant. And as you can see, each of these games take their fair time to process the audio before it even reaches the Windows audio stack. Also, the differences between the games are pretty wild. Like Overwatch is taking more than twice as long as Valorant to process the audio. But typically there's nothing we can do about the game's built-in audio latency. Games usually don't have a setting to change the audio buffer, except Counter-Strike. CS has a console command to adjust the mix ahead, which allows users to change the size of the audio buffer. So you could play around to find the smallest number that still works on your machine before breaking the audio. Back in the days, Battle Nonsense was able to demonstrate nicely how the setting can reduce the audio latency, but this was in CSGO. The command is still there in CS2 today, but according to my testing, it doesn't have an effect anymore. CS2 supposedly uses the most optimal setting already, but seeing how much worse the audio lag is in CS2 than it is in Valorant, I'm not so sure about that. In comparison to the game's built-in audio latency, the latency that the audio device itself is causing is often negligible. Every audio device has its own buffer too, but typically it's small. The RME interface allows us to choose the size of this audio buffer, but for buffer sizes up to 256 samples, the effect is so small that it gets buried in the deviation. For some context, the 32 sample buffer I've been using for most of these tests equates to just 0.7 milliseconds of lag at 84 kHz. But then at 512 samples, something strange happens. There's a sudden, roughly 43 millisecond latency increase. However, it's not the audio device itself that's responsible for this jump. 512 samples only equate to less than 11 milliseconds of lag. The 43 millisecond jump is actually caused by the way games process audio. I really don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of how this all works. It's pretty boring, but the practical takeaway here really is that if you have the choice, use buffer sizes of 256 samples or smaller. And the other takeaway is that the audio device itself only contributes a small amount to the overall audio latency. The game's own audio processing is a much bigger factor. But thing is, even if all game developers were using the smallest audio buffers possible, there's still a good amount of audio lag caused by the Windows audio stack. See, when testing through the LDAT application, we're still getting roughly 36 milliseconds of latency latency best case. And most of this latency can be attributed to how Windows handles audio. As some of you might have suspected, the super low sub 3 millisecond latency number I was able to get with the RME interface earlier is only possible when using ASIO. This basically circumvents the traditional audio path that games are using. ASIO allows the application to talk to the audio device directly, bypassing most of the stuff that adds latency. But games don't support ASIO. Instead, they route their audio through the entire Windows audio stack, which is well known to be laggy. So why do they do that? Well, convenience probably. Virtually every device works with Windows audio, but not every device supports ASIO. And traditionally, ASIO is single client, meaning that if a game was using your audio device via ASIO, no other application could. No Discord, no Spotify. You're just gonna get game audio. However, multi-client ASIO drivers already exist. My RME interface has those and happily accepts playback from a DAW via ASIO, while I can still play something else through Chrome, for instance, via the classic Windows audio path. So it would also happily accept low latency game audio via ASIO, where I could still hear the Discord chat through the normal Windows route. So the fix already exists. The music world solved the latency problem decades ago, but for gamers, it's a locked door. And you know, it's a bit of a dilemma really. Humans react so much faster to sound, and yet we've been totally neglecting the audio latency. We've been getting closer and closer to a near-instant visual pipeline over the last few years, thanks to super high refresh rate monitors, crazy fast mice and powerful PC hardware, and I'm all for it really, but that success has created a massive imbalance. It really is about time to bring our audio up to speed. Thanks for watching, bis zum nächsten Video.